I would like now to ask Hooman Majd to come. Hooman is actually an author. Many of you may have already seen him in various television programs on the but he has also written two important books on Iran, Iranian domestic politics. More importantly, he is actually is the only one that actually spent any considerable amount of time in Iran, and I think I could say that he's also reasonably well plugged, at least with some sense. So thank you very much, Hooman, for coming, and we're eager to hear you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Shirin. I'm not sure what else I can add after all those great presentations. I think we all, it's kind of like preaching to the converted here. Everyone's basically saying the same thing. Sanctions don't work. Threats of war don't work, and so on and so forth. I'm not an academic, and I'm not a historian. I'm a journalist and writer, so I basically observe. And Shirin is correct in saying that I do have continued to travel to Iran despite some difficulties here and there since the post-election crisis in Iran. I think what I want to talk about really is more about the American misunderstanding or underestimation of Iran. There's a reason why when they asked me, what do you want to title your brief talk, I said Misunderestimating Iran, which is, bumbling in the language as well as in real life. And I do believe that it really started more with President Bush than in previous administrations, only because of the nuclear issue being much, much more in the forefront of the discussions on Iranian-U.S. relations because of what was revealed supposedly by the Mujahideen in 2001 about the Iranian nuclear program. And then it becoming much more important. I think it's important to think about all the things that we were talking about here, which is the infighting inside the regime, which Hushang pointed out and Shirin correctly pointed out, has been going on forever, actually. It was going on in the Shah's time, was going on in the Qajar time, and continues. And that's part of the Persian political system, and I don't think that's ever going to change. No matter who is in charge, whether it happened under Khomeini, who had a much firmer grip on Iranian politics than even Khamenei, although Khamenei's grip is much firmer now than it probably has been ever in his 20 years as supreme leader. So I think that's not unusual. I think what is important to think about when we read about things in the media about how Iran's political infighting is affecting the nuclear issue, how Iran's political infighting is making it an unstable country, politically unstable, is to remember the history of what these nuclear negotiations are all about. If we believe some of these media reports, if we believe what the Los Angeles Times says, what the New York Times has repeated, the Washington Post, both in editorials and in op-eds and in articles written by various journalists, that the U.S. at this point is prepared to allow some form of enrichment on Iranian soil. And the U.S. wants Iran to stop enriching at 20% uranium, 20%, and it wants basically for the Fordo facility to be closed. Well, let's think back to what Iran's position was before President Obama took power. It didn't have Fordo. It wasn't enriching at 20%. And it had far, far fewer centrifuges. So as far as Iran is concerned, they've done pretty well. They've put facts on the ground that are now almost impossible to roll back. If we're talking about giving up 20% enrichment for Iran, it's not a big deal as far as Iran's concerned. Despite all the hullabaloo, despite all the political infighting, despite the Green Movement, despite the human rights abuses, the nuclear program has gone forward. They've managed to create facts on the ground where the 3.5% enrichment now, today, looks damn good to us. If they were to limit to 3.5%, that would look really good to us. We'd say, hey, wait, we've won. When in fact, that was the position that Iran had until 2009. Fordo, which is a facility which was built specifically to withstand a military attack, which only has 3,000 centrifuges in it at this point, and probably doesn't have room for a lot more, and therefore is unlikely to be the kind of facility that could create bomb after bomb after bomb. Again, I'm not a nuclear expert, but could be a manufacturing place for nuclear weapons. That is something that is very specifically designed by the Iranians to counter the threat by Israel and by the United States to militarily take out their nuclear system. So I think if that threat is removed, verifiably removed, in other words, if there's some kind of non-aggression pact that the United States could sign, I don't think the Iranian regime would have a problem with maybe not mothballing Fordo completely, because once they've built it, they're not going to destroy it themselves, but at least temporarily putting a halt to any activities there, or some kind of agreement that there wasn't going to be an attack in the next X number of years while these negotiations go on. So Iran's poker has actually been really good. Their bluffing has been very good. And I think we have to recognize that we could have had a deal in the Bush administration where Iran would have been enriching uranium on its own soil with what was called back then a pilot program. I was present when former President Khatami came to the United States in 2006, a year after Ahmadinejad took office. And although he came here not as a representative of the government of Iran, there was no question in anybody's mind that he was in contact with the authorities back home, particularly with the office of the Supreme Leader, if not the Supreme Leader himself, during his trip here. There was a dinner at Ambassador Zarif's house here, who was the UN ambassador at the time, for the Council on Foreign Relations. Richard Haas was there, a bunch of people were there, basically from the Council on Foreign Relations, where former President Khatami laid out what Iran would be willing to do, which was, it was willing to, at that point, a year into Ahmadinejad's administration, and this was, what they call second track diplomacy, I suppose, was willing to limit enrichment at Natanz to 164 centrifuges, 164. And Khatami knew that evening that that message would get back to the White House that night, if not that night, certainly by the next day. And there was no response to that. So back in 2006, again, 6 years ago, we could have potentially had a deal where Iran had no more than 164 centrifuges spinning. Today they have 10,000 or 9,000, 8,900. The number goes up and down depending on who you ask and when you ask it. But I think the real issue here is that Iran is consistently being underestimated by the United States. I'm not suggesting that the Iranians don't underestimate the US or don't underestimate the resolve of the US. They do, and they have done in the past, and they continue to do so today. They have underestimated the resolve of the Obama administration when it came to pressure, when it came to sanctions. They completely underestimated that, and I think they have been taken by surprise in terms of the severity of the sanctions, but not just the sanctions on the part of the United States, but the compliance with the sanctions, unilateral American sanctions, by many of their so-called friends, including even today, India cutting back on its oil threat. So I think Iran has been surprised by that. They were surprised by the decision taken by SWIFT, for example, agreeing to an American request that they stop handling Iranian bank transfers, which is impactful, which is hugely actually impactful on the Iranian economy, and I think people recognize that. As Hussein pointed out, Ali Akbar Jawanfekh, who is President Ahmadinejad's advisor and who is the editor of the newspaper that he was referring to, that slammed the negotiating team for asking for sanctions to be removed, I think they're all very well aware. President Ahmadinejad himself, his boss, has said the sanctions are affecting Iran. They're very well aware that sanctions are affecting them. The government. And the Supreme Leader is not so isolated that he has no idea what's going on in society. He has a lot of different advisors. He has a lot of advisors who give him different advice. He still listens to some of the reformists, as well as the conservatives and the hardline fundamentalists. But I think what we have to consider in America is there are, as various people have pointed out today already, there are people who would love to see these talks sabotaged. I include the Wall Street Journal and Rupert Murdoch in that group. I include even, and I'm going to make some enemies, but I include people like David Albright in that group, who, for some strange reason, decided that this week he's going to publicize the fact that Ali Akbar Salehi, the U.S.-trained foreign minister of Iran, was in charge of acquiring technology, nuclear technology, back in 1991. Like 1991 and 2012 are in any way related. Whether he did or didn't is completely irrelevant, I think, to what the talks are today. The timing of putting out this report to me is very suspicious. And I'm not just some Iranian conspiracy theorist. I am Iranian, but I'm also American. I grew up here all my life, so I do take conspiracy theories that Iranians love with a grain of salt. But in this case, I'm kind of a little surprised by these little things that are popping up a few days before Baghdad on the part of Americans who I believe have different agendas. We also have in America, and I'm not including present company, but we have a lot of people who've made a career out of analyzing Iran. If the nuclear deal is signed, sealed, and delivered tomorrow, I think a lot of them might be out of work. I think that I've tried to not rely on being an expert, so I find that to be to my advantage, and I'll still continue to be able to write and hopefully do my journalism, maybe non-Iran related if there's a deal, but I do think that there are a lot of people who have specific agendas, whether it's an agenda to overthrow the regime in Iran on the part of Iranians and Iranian-Americans here, who may have access to people in power or people in former positions of power who do have access to people in power, such as Paul bringing up the MEK. And I think all these agendas are here conspiring to do something that I think no American or no Iranian really wants, which is to lead us down to a path of either war or this continued hostility, which exists to deflect attention away from a number of things, including something that we don't want to really talk about very much in the United States, the elephant in the room, the Israeli issue. And the Israeli issue as it relates to the Palestinian issue, and as it relates to the peace process, which, as we have seen in the last 3.5 years of Obama's administration, has been completely sidetracked and sidelined because of, mainly when it comes to foreign policy, because of both the Arab Spring, to be fair, not just Iran, but also the threat to the security of the world is Iran. The threat to the security of the world is not Palestine. It is not the PLO. It is not Islamic Jihad even. It's Iran. And if that narrative continues, I think it's to the advantage of certain people, including the Likud party, who doesn't appear to want to make peace and is in power in Israel right now. And this is not something that I say, and my Israeli friends who are journalists say the same thing. So I think there's a lot of factors here that we have to consider, and I'm probably relatively pessimistic that there is a deal that can be made, no matter what Iran agrees to, between now and November, that President Obama would be able to agree to. And I think there is no deal that the U.S. would agree to, that Iran is able to agree to between now and November, if you take into consideration the red lines that Israel has and the fact that President Obama is in a re-election campaign. By the way, the Iranians are very well aware of this. I was in Iran most of last year. When you talk to any Iranian official, they're very smart about all this stuff. It's not like they're completely ignorant. They underestimate America. They underestimated Obama, I think, many times. But they're not, they do understand the limitations in America. When it comes to sanctions and lifting of sanctions, last year, this is last year, I was talking to one official and talking about sanctions. They said, we understand that Obama can't just lift sanctions. It's Congress and this and it's that. We understand that. I think when the Iranians talk about relief from sanctions, they're talking about relief from sanctions that are about to take effect in July. And I think there are certain sanctions that the US president can lift or can waive at least. And they're looking for those gestures. I think the Iranian government is looking for certain, or at least the supreme leader, who is, as Hussein said, in charge and actually has always been really in charge. He's allowed some of the other people to continue the fight for him, but he is ultimately now in charge, and he's made it very clear that he's in charge. He has to be able to say to the Iranian people that they got something in return. I mean, if Iran Air was able to buy a brand new 747 because President Obama waived the sanction on selling a passenger plane to Iran, that would be a huge deal. It's not that huge of a deal to us, I don't think, in America, but that would actually be a huge symbolic gesture for the Iranian people. And I think it would go a long way to alleviating some of the concerns that Iran has in terms of trust. And that's a very, very simple thing. The Friday prayer leader, Yazd, who has since passed away, said that to me when Obama first took office. He said, when Obama first took office and I happened to be in Iran doing a cover story for Newsweek, actually, at the time, I said, well, isn't it good that, President Bush is gone, Obama's here, and he says all these nice things? He said, yeah, he says all these nice things, but let him do one thing. I said, like what? He's like, sell us one plane, And I think that would reflect the feeling at, Friday prayer leaders in Iran get their instructions from the Supreme Leader's office. They report to the Supreme Leader's office. And so I think that reflected a sense from Iran that they wanted something beyond words from Obama. And, I don't think they feel like they got that. So there is cause for optimism, but I'm pessimistic now really only because of the election. I think I'm not enough of an expert on Israeli politics, or I have no idea how Netanyahu is judging all of what's going on here, whether he feels, and I've had this discussion with Israeli journalists, whether he feels that Obama is going to win and therefore it's better for him to attack Iran now than after Obama is in his second term, or whether he thinks there's a chance that Mitt Romney could win, in which case, if Mitt Romney wins, then he's already said he's going to outsource our diplomacy to Israel anyway. He'll be, basically Netanyahu will be Secretary of State. So it won't be a problem. I don't know what he's thinking. I have no idea. I don't know very many people who do know what he's thinking. Even people who are close to Netanyahu apparently say they're not sure. Jeff Goldberg at The Atlantic says he's not sure what Netanyahu is thinking. If Jeffrey Goldberg doesn't know, I sure as hell don't know. But the pessimism, I think, has to be there because when you have statements by the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, saying that this is kind of the last chance, the Baghdad talks, and when you've got statements by various other people, including the Israelis, saying that it's now or never, Iran has to come with something, giving something. I think you're, again, putting the narrative back in the way it was, this idea of threats, if you don't do this, then this will happen. And I don't think Iran can afford to, as Hooman said, can afford to negotiate meaningfully under these kinds of threats. The legitimacy of the Islamic Republic is based on a number of things. Everybody thinks that the legitimacy of the Supreme Leader is only religious. It's not. The Islamic Republic, as the Supreme Leader, is a part of and he's not supreme for nothing. He is the most important part of this Islamic Republic. But the legitimacy of the Republic is founded on religion, yes, because the Iranian people are religious, and they do, in general, I'm generalizing, of course, they have, certainly since 1979, were a religious conservative society that did believe in their priests and the word of their priests. The legitimacy is founded upon its sense of justice, which is being eroded today. When you have the sense of justice, which they've talked about for 30 years, it's been eroded. It's been eroded by the Green Movement. It's been eroded by people getting beaten up on the streets. It's been eroded by political prisoners. And they're aware of this, by the way. The clerics are very well aware of this. This is why there's some internal fighting even within the clerical hierarchy on this particular issue. It's been eroded by the huge gap between the rich and the poor in Tehran. When I was living in Tehran, in my neighborhood, there was a 24-year-old guy who drives a Bugatti Veyron. Bugatti Veyron, I don't think there's one in Washington. I don't think there's one in New York even. There might be one or two in California. It's the most expensive car in the world. It's $1 million US in America. In Iran, he can't register it because they won't register the car. In Iran, the DMV won't register. Say, what the hell is this? To have it serviced, he has to fly it to Dubai. In Iran, it cost him $2 million. If he were to be allowed to register it, it would cost him $4 million. He's 24 years old. So the gap between the rich and the poor in Iran, something that you didn't see even until 5 or 6 years ago, has grown immeasurably. The economy has affected the poor far more than it's affected the wealthy. So that legitimacy is people are starting to see that. I mean, when you're in a cab, in a taxi cab in Tehran, and an Audi R8, sorry for putting all these names out there, an Audi R8 that costs $120,000 in the US, that I didn't even know what it looked like because I live in New York, so we don't see cars that much. And the taxi driver says, hey, look at that R8. What do you think that kid did to make that much money? I said, well, how do you know about an R8? Oh, we know. We know these kids, they get this money from, we don't know where from. So you've got that legitimacy of social justice being slowly eroded. So there's one last thing that the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic is founded on, and that is independence and not being subservient to any greater power, something that Iran has been for the last at least 200 to 300 years, in the minds of the revolutionaries, including the revolutionaries who today disagree with the Islamic regime, such as the reformists, such as the Green Movement people, even people who would want to overthrow this regime, even the Mujahideen Khal, who are sworn enemies, even they used to say, at least, until they wanted favors from Israel, they used to say that they wanted independence from the greater powers. What Hooman alluded to is absolutely true. I mean, it's not just Khamenei personally, but the entire regime in Iran has constantly put this nuclear issue on par with the oil nationalization issue of 1953, which we know about because of the CIA-sponsored coup, we know about because of Prime Minister Mossadegh, for those of us who followed Iranian history, but which is a very, very important thing for the Iranian psyche. 55 years later, 60 years later, it's still very important. And even though this particular Islamic regime has not been very kind to the memory of Mossadegh himself, because he was basically secular, I think, more than anything else. But I think that using his name, using the oil nationalization, there were even articles in Iran when the nuclear issue first came up, and when Iran was taken to the Security Council. If you read the Iranian media, they compared what Britain had said in 1953 about oil nationalization to what the US was now saying, calling oil nationalization in 1953 a threat to the national security of the world, because Iran wanted its own rights. So I think a repetition of that is absolutely impossible for the Iranian government. I think that's something that Hillary Clinton, President Obama, all her and his advisors should be, one would hope, well aware of, that it is impossible for the US to make any deal with Iran that would endanger that legitimacy. If you start losing a little bit of your theological legitimacy, if you start losing a little bit of your social justice legitimacy, and then you lose the last thing that you had, which is actually the one thing that pretty much all Iranians could agree on. Because the religious stuff the secular guys didn't care about, the secular women didn't care about, they're fighting it actually. They don't want to wear the hijab, the women who are secular. The guys don't want to, they want to be able to have a drink in a bar in Iran, you know? So those things, they're not going to agree on. On the social justice, many of the rich upper middle class Iranians never agreed with that. They think Iran should be as capitalist as it can be. They're like, you know, Mitt Romney. They don't like the poor. So the only thing that all of them can agree on is that national interest thing, that national independence. And that's the one thing they can agree on. This is the one thing that this nuclear policy has been for the Iranian government. I think if we're not aware of that, then I think that we're going to continually underestimate the Iranians. The one thing they can rally around, the one thing they can be confident on. What we shouldn't be confident about at all is regime change, the idea of regime change. And Ambassador Gutman's brought it up a couple of times that that's potentially something that we could, we could do business with a different regime. I just don't see at this point the way we are going, I mean, the way the relations between the US, or at least the West, and Iran are, that regime change is in the cards anytime soon. And I think you agree. I don't think that that's a disagreement. But I think this concept of regime change and the constant bringing up of regime change, especially in our media, is very harmful to the potential for some kind of détente between Iran and the US. I think that the Iranian people, if you ask them, inside Iran, whether they're pro-regime or anti-regime, they tend to all, pretty much, not all, but most agree that if this pressure on the Iranian regime was removed, if this pressure of this concept of regime change, this concept of threats, the assassinations, the this, that, and the pressure on the nuclear program was removed, there would be much more room for civil society to grow. And there's much more room for, if not regime change, at least regime alteration, at least a sort of reform, democratization of Iran that far more people in Iran want than don't want. And I would even include some of the very conservative politicians, like Mohsen Rezai, who was brought up, who used to be a Revolutionary Guardsman, who competed against Ahmadinejad in the 2005 election, who do want to see some a better form of Islamic democracy than exists today. But they all recognize when you talk to them that under the circumstances today, where they feel that they're under threat, they feel that the CIA, they feel that the American and Israeli intelligence services and the British intelligence services are there to undermine the Islamic Republic, are there to bring it down by any means, that as long as that's going on, nobody dares say anything. And then they feel that they can't really organize in any way to bring about the kind of changes that they believe that the Iranian people want, whether it's within this system or it's going to be a future system. So I think that, again, the hope that we're going to have a different regime to deal with in 2 years or 5 years, I think is unrealistic. I think The idea that Iran is weak at this point is unrealistic. I think the administration should, again, not underestimate Iran's ability to do the things that it says it's going to do. We didn't think it could enrich uranium to 20%. It did it. We didn't think they could build fuel rods. They've done it. They've built fuel rods for the, now we don't know if they work yet. So hopefully when they put the fuel rods in, the reactor won't explode. But we know that they built them. So we shouldn't underestimate Iran, and in continuing this dialogue, I hope that we can get between now, the end of May, and November 4th, we can get to a point where at least we will have prevented war, or prevented the warmongers from taking us to that step. But I don't see any real movement beyond that.